The pines that marked the western border of the Whitaker Farm rose tall and narrow, their trunks blackened by decades of frost and their needles whispering in a language older than the county itself. Beyond them, the land opened into a sweep of green so perfect that it seemed almost unnatural. Fields rolled out in every direction, the soil dark and rich, each furrow carved with the precision of a man who knew every inch of his property as he knew his own heartbeat. The spring of 1861 was generous here, the sun warm, the air fragrant with tilled earth and distant lilacs. Yet for reasons that few could put into words, strangers rarely lingered near Whitaker land. It wasn't fear exactly, but a kind of instinct, the way a bird might change direction mid-flight to avoid a storm it cannot yet see. The Whitakers themselves were a picture of modest, upright living. Josiah Whitaker, broad-shouldered but soft in voice, carried the manner of a man shaped by both war and prayer. His wife Prudence kept her hair pinned high and her dresses plain, her hands always moving, kneading bread, mending clothes, shelling peas at the porch table in the long evenings. They gave to the church, hosted neighbors for harvest suppers, and never spoke ill of anyone. This was the armor they wore, though no one called it that, and behind it the truth moved like water beneath ice. Visitors to the farm always remarked on its uncanny order. There was not a weed in sight, not a broken fence post, not a tool left rusting in the grass. The fields seemed to hum faintly even on windless days. When the Whitakers walked their land, they did so slowly, pausing in odd places, gazing at the ground as if reading something written there. The southern boundary was lined with a fence of rough-hewn boards, not tall, but somehow uninviting. Children who wandered too close swore they heard a low vibration under their feet, as if the earth itself were alive. Parents dismissed it as nonsense, yet kept their children close on Sundays when the Whitakers came to town. No one in the parish could remember the last time the Whitakers hired outside help for their planting or harvest. Josiah insisted the soil was easy to work if you knew its temperament. In truth, he guarded it fiercely, never letting another man's hands turn it over. He and Prudence moved in the fields like keepers in a chapel, each row a pew, each furrow a prayer. Even when the Civil War draft swept through Wisconsin, Josiah's name was bypassed, the county doctor declaring him too vital to the food supply to risk losing. Some whispered that he had paid for that exemption in something more than a coin. There was a quietness to the farm at night that unsettled travelers. While other homesteads glowed with lamplight and the muffled sounds of family inside, the Whitaker house often sat dark by early evening, as if the household had gone to bed with the sun. Yet from the road, sharp-eyed passers-by claimed to see a single lantern moving through the fields long after midnight. The light was steady, not the wavering flame of a handheld lamp, but fixed, as if marking a place where something needed watching. The pines at the edge of the property cast long shadows over the eastern pasture, where the grass grew thicker and greener than anywhere else. In spring, mist would gather there in the mornings, curling low and dense, refusing to burn off even after the sun rose high. Livestock avoided the spot. When a neighbor's cow strayed there and was later found dead without a mark on it, the owner muttered about bad water, though the stream ran clear. Josiah offered to help bury the animal, choosing a site at the very back of the man's property. When the grave was filled, he pressed the soil down with his boots, standing there for a long moment as if considering something before turning back toward his own land. For all its beauty, the Whitaker Farm was a place that never fully welcomed the outsider. It was a stage set with the props of honest labor and Christian virtue, but there was no warmth in its center, no casual laughter or restless children or music drifting through open windows. Those who left the farm carried with them an impression they could not quite name. That everything they had seen was deliberate, rehearsed, and that somewhere just beyond the rows of corn and potatoes something waited, hidden, until the right season came to bring it to the surface. In town, the Whitakers were known as a family untouched by scandal, a trio whose every public gesture seemed measured for decency. Josiah Whitaker carried himself with the solemnity of a man who had seen too much in life, though the war he was said to have fought in left behind no stories anyone could clearly recall. He walked with an even, deliberate pace, tipping his hat to every woman, pausing to greet every man. When asked about his past, he would lower his eyes, murmur something about God's mercy, and change the subject. Prudence Whitaker stood beside him as a shadow made of bone and quiet resolve. Her face set in that mild expression that could have been mistaken for kindness if one didn't linger too long on the stillness of her eyes. She spoke only when addressed, and even then with the practiced warmth of a church hostess. Not false exactly, but never deep enough to touch the core of her. Their niece Eliza was the quietest of the three. Brought to the farm as a girl after her parents' sudden deaths, she had grown into a pale young woman with hair like faded wheat and eyes that seemed to belong to a much older person. She walked with a slow, careful grace, as if each step had been thought about before it was taken. People in town assumed she was simply shy, perhaps still grieving. Yet now and then someone would notice her in moments when she thought herself unseen. Her mouth curved in a faint private smile while watching the butcher's block at the market, or her fingers brushing the dirt in the churchyard as if testing its quality. On Sundays, the family occupied the same pew they had claimed since arriving in the county, their posture straight, their hymn books held close to their chests. They sang softly, almost in unison, as though rehearsed at home. They never joined in the gossip after service, never lingered to trade goods or share pie, but neither did they withdraw rudely. Instead, they would offer small blessings to anyone who approached. A jar of preserves left on a neighbor's porch, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a handful of dried herbs pressed into a palm with instructions for brewing. These gifts were always accepted with gratitude, though some recipients later swore that the bread had a taste they could not place, or that the herbs brewed into a tea that left their dreams restless for nights after. At the farm, life appeared just as upright. Visitors saw clean floors, orderly cupboards, and an abundance of preserved goods lined in careful rows. Yet there was an absence here too, one that was harder to name. No children's laughter, no idle singing while hanging laundry, no clatter of a busy household. The silence in the Whitaker home was not an empty one, but a waiting one. The kind that suggested everyone inside was attuned to something beyond the walls, listening for a sound that never came, or one they prayed would. Eliza especially seemed bound to that listening. Neighbors who passed the farm late at night would sometimes glimpse her in the fields alone, holding a lantern low to the ground. She moved slowly between rows, her gaze fixed downward, occasionally crouching to touch the soil or lift some small object before slipping it into the pocket of her apron. By morning there would be no sign she had been there at all, save for the faint marks in the dirt where her knees had pressed. When questioned about these habits, Josiah would smile in that mild way of his and say that Eliza had always loved tending to the land, that she had a special touch with the roots and the flowers. Prudence would nod, adding nothing, her hands still working whatever task lay before her. No one pressed further. It felt somehow improper to do so, as if to pry at a door meant to stay closed. The Whitakers' reputation for never speaking ill of others was part of the same armor that kept questions away. When a neighbor's boy was caught stealing eggs from another farm, Josiah defended him as just hungry. When a woman was whispering about meeting a man after dark, Prudence brought her a basket of fruit without a word. This generosity disarmed people, even those who sensed that something lay coiled beneath it. If the Whitakers could extend grace to others so freely, what possible harm could they carry within themselves? The truth was that their silence, their kindness, and their calm were not born of innocence but of discipline. Each gesture was measured, each word chosen for how it would be received. They understood that to move freely one must first be invisible in plain sight. And so they wore their goodness like a mask carved to perfection, polished by years of use, never slipping, never cracking, not even when the faint scent of soil clung to Eliza's skirts on Sunday mornings, fresh and damp as if she had been kneeling in the fields before dawn, her hands deep in the earth. The culling shed sat lower than the main barn, its roofline crouched as if the building held its breath, boards stained by old smoke and a briny sweetness that did not belong to pork. People called it a slaughter place for hogs, and Josiah let them, even pointing to the neat row of iron hooks while he said in his soft voice that a good farmer wastes nothing. Yet the hooks were wrong for hogs, narrow and long, with a second notch that locked whatever was hung so it could not twist, a design made for control rather than weight. The floor wore a careful blanket of straw that never scattered because Prudence spread it too evenly, hiding a trap door whose handle had been disguised as a knot in the plank. The door lifted to a cramped stair, and the descent felt like slipping down a throat into a room lined with scorched brick that had not been blackened by accident but cured on purpose to drink heat without glow. Symbols ran around the walls like a belt, a marriage of scripture fragments, harvest tallies, and shapes older than either. Cut shallow so a passerby might miss them, but traced again and again by fingertip oil until the brick darkened in circles where the family's touch returned. In a corner sat a bucket of bone ash and a jar sealed with wax that smelled faintly of milk turned strange. A binder, Josiah called it when no one was there to argue with his chosen words. Nothing in the room was chaotic, nothing built from rage or impulse. It was a study, almost a workshop, and each device served time rather than force. A plank cradle that tilted by a palm-sized wheel in increments so small they were felt more than seen. Leather straps that tightened by teeth spaced evenly instead of buckles. fine chains that slid through pulleys oiled with ash until they moved with the hush of cloth, and small clay jars set near the brick so they kept a constant warmth that never scalded and never cooled. Prudence measured lye by weight, not spoon, saying precision was mercy, and washed wood until the grain rose like skin after frost. Eliza swept in circles from the wall inward, drawing the room tight, and when she finished she would stand still as if listening for a sound below hearing. A low pulse that others called imagination, but that she treated like a clock. The method did not begin with pain, but with arrangement. Josiah believed the body was a field with seasons hidden inside, and he had learned to coax one season at a time by making the room behave like weather. Heat moving across brick like a slow tide, angle-altering flow without choke, straps providing firmness without bite, and position-correcting posture before the mind had a chance to rebel. He laid out his instruments as a farmer sets seed and tool in the order of use, and he spoke only to himself in words that sounded like notes from a ledger. Yield, binding, return. Words stolen from harvest and church until they meant something simpler to him. A cycle without faces. He would begin by finding a pulse and counting it with 2 fingers pressed near the throat, not roughly, but with a certainty that set the tempo. He lifted the clay jar, tested the water's surface with his knuckle until a faint ring formed, and dabbed a cloth across a forehead the way a nurse might, because keeping temperature steady extended the window in which a person remained present and quiet enough for his adjustments to take root. The hooks above were for position, not spectacle. A notch raised an arm by degrees, and a counterweight lowered a shoulder just enough to change the shape of breath. So the chest made a soft effort again and again, neither collapsing nor racing, a controlled rhythm that preserved awareness while softening it. He wanted life to stay close, not as a taunt, but as a condition of the work, because a field cannot receive what a field does not feel. Prudence watched the signs that could not be measured by scale, the dulling of focus, the way hands trembled toward or away from contact. And she would place the damp cloth again, not in comfort but in timing, because shock ruined sequence, and sequence was the point. Eliza learned to hear breath change half a second before a sound escaped the mouth, and she would lift a palm, small and steady, to signal Josiah to ease a notch or tilt a fraction, their movements threaded like a practiced hymn. What they did there was not noisy, not frantic, and never messy. Josiah called mess waste, and he refused it with the disgust other men saved for sin, wiping wood until it squeaked under cloth, scrubbing under his nails with salt, and sanding the hooks to a dull silver that reflected shapes but not faces. When an ending was needed, he chose one he could time, an ending that sounded like a prayer because prayers were familiar and familiarity kept fear from turning wild. Afterward, they moved with the calm of people putting a room back after guests, straps reset to their starting marks, chains coiled, straw raked, smooth ledger closed with a thread around it, the wax on the binder jar reheated and sealed flat. The smell steered toward smoke and pepper so that anyone who stepped inside would think only of meat and fire. No proof greeted curious eyes because the Whitakers understood attention and how to direct it. Firewood stacked against the thickest wall, hams hung high as decoys. Door left ajar on warm days so the shed breathed like any other. If a neighbor came unannounced, Josiah nudged the kettle to steam and spoke of rain while Prudence wrapped a neat parcel, and Eliza guided the visitor to the yard, where the light was clean and the ground gave no secrets. In this shed, their kindness found its true shape, neat and controlled, each gesture tuned to a purpose they called necessary. They told themselves nothing disappears, everything changes shape and goes on, and the soil would answer them later with proof that felt like blessing, though it was only the echo of what had been taken. The fields behind the Whitaker house looked no different from any other in the county. Rows of potatoes, beets, and carrots pushing green shoots into the air. Yet there was a density to the soil that other farmers noticed when they stepped onto it. Their boots sank slightly deeper, as if the ground was not just rich but thick with something more than dirt. Josiah called it the method, a word he never explained, as if it was not a thing to describe but to witness. He spoke of the land like a child that could be taught, and he had spent years refining a recipe that no one had ever seen him write down. In public, he offered hints designed to mislead: a certain ash from hardwood fires, lime sifted fine, animal blood boiled and cooled before mixing. But the real core of his method was not in the ingredients, it was in the binding, a process he said brought the whole of a thing back into the soil. In truth, the mixture began in the culling shed, not in the barnyard. From certain bodies, those chosen for their youth, their health, or in some cases the stubbornness that made their final hours more deliberate, he and Prudence would harvest specific parts with a surgeon's patience. Marrow from the largest bones, thin strips of muscle dried until they broke with a soft snap, fat rendered down to an oil that carried a faint sweetness. Each was stored in its own clay jar, never mixed until the moment of binding. The jars were buried at the base of the farthest pines for weeks, letting the forest's dampness leach away what Josiah called noise. When dug up, they carried the deep, cold scent of earth, and he treated them as though they were relics. The binding was Eliza's task. She worked at a low table in the kitchen, the windows shuttered even on warm days. She would pour bone ash into a wide ceramic basin, add lime in small increments, then slowly work in the oil until the mixture clumped like wet clay. Into this she would crumble the dried muscle, each pinch measured so precisely that she weighed it on a set of brass scales kept in a locked drawer. Sometimes she hummed as she worked, a low, tuneless sound that seemed to belong to the rhythm of her hands rather than to any song. The final addition was always the marrow, spooned in last, its texture melting into the mass like butter into dough. By the time she was finished, the mixture was a pale grayish substance with flecks of darker matter, and it carried a smell that could not be placed. Not sweet, not foul, just unmistakably alive. At dusk, Josiah would take the basin into the fields. He never spread it like common fertilizer. Instead, he knelt at each planting row, parting the soil gently and pressing small handfuls into the earth with the care of a man tucking in a child. The handfuls were always placed in a sequence. First near the largest plants, then in a widening pattern that spiraled outward. This spiral, he insisted, kept the return from becoming restless. He never explained what restless meant, but he often lingered in the field afterward, watching the rows as though expecting movement. Within days, the effects were visible. Leaves thickened, stalks straightened, and the soil held moisture long after rain had gone. Other farmers who tried to imitate him failed miserably. Their plants yellowed or their soil hardened as if rejecting the gift. Some came to Josiah for advice, and he would offer a bag of his starter ash, ordinary wood ash that gave no results. Then watch with quiet satisfaction as they returned weeks later, muttering about bad luck. The Whitakers' crops, meanwhile, seemed to double in yield each year. The townsfolk told themselves it was simply the blessing of good land and hard work. But those who worked briefly for the Whitakers before quitting without reason spoke of something else. They said the soil in the far fields was warm to the touch even on frosty mornings. They said worms there grew thicker, almost finger-sized, and sometimes when a spade struck deep, the earth gave a faint resistance like the tug of buried roots, except there were no roots that deep. One man swore that while turning the soil he saw a pale curve beneath it, smooth and hard, and when he tried to uncover it, Josiah's hand closed around his wrist with a strength that made his fingers go numb. Without a word, Josiah filled the hole himself and sent the man home with a bag of potatoes, telling him there was no more work for him that season. By the end of the summer, the Whitakers' harvest was the envy of the county. Their potatoes were heavy and unblemished, their carrots long and straight, their beets so dark they stained the hands like wine. At the market, Prudence stood beside the cart, smiling softly as coins and goods changed hands, while Josiah loaded each sack with care, always slipping in an extra piece as a blessing. And all the while Eliza kept to the edge of the stall, her fingers stained faintly gray, watching the customers carry away the fruits of a method no one else could ever quite name. A method whose roots reached far deeper than the plants it fed. It was the autumn of 1862 when the first man went missing, though at the time no one in town called it that. Reverend Cyrus Bell had been traveling between small parishes, preaching against the sins of vanity and drink, when the Whitakers invited him to supper. The story went that he had stopped at their farm to ask directions after his horse threw a shoe. Josiah offered to see to the animal, Prudence to warm him with bread and stew before he continued on his way. That was the last time anyone saw him. At first there was no alarm. Traveling preachers often changed their routes without notice, sometimes vanishing for months into territories where news traveled slow. But when Reverend Bell failed to appear at his next scheduled sermon 2 counties over, inquiries began. The Whitakers were calm when questioned, explaining that he had left after dusk, his horse newly shod and his saddlebags filled with food for the road. They assumed he had taken the shorter, wooded path north. The sheriff nodded and left, seeing nothing unusual in the way Josiah stood with his hands folded or how Prudence kept her eyes on the ground. 2 days later, the horse was found tethered to a post at the edge of a disused logging trail, the leather saddle polished, the bridle oiled. The saddlebag still held the bread Prudence had given him, wrapped neatly in cloth. There were no tracks to follow, only the quiet of pine needles underfoot and the slow decay of leaves. The disappearance might have faded into rumor if not for the strange warmth noticed in the Whitakers' far field that same month. Frost had gripped the county early, silvering rooftops and turning the ground hard before November. Yet in the Whitakers' lower pasture the earth was soft and damp, giving underfoot as if it had been turned only hours earlier. In the morning, steam rose from the soil in thin threads that drifted toward the pines. Some neighbors mentioned this in passing, trying to keep their tone light, but their eyes stayed watchful. Josiah met such comments with a small laugh, saying the land held heat from the summer better than most. Prudence agreed with a faint nod, and that was the end of the conversation. On the surface. Beneath it, something began to shift. That winter, children walking past the farm on their way to the schoolhouse whispered about the odd way crows gathered on the fence posts near the far field. They did not call or flap their wings, but sat in perfect stillness watching the ground. Once Eliza was seen scattering handfuls of something white at their feet. The birds didn't move to eat. They only tilted their heads as though marking the moment before taking off all at once, their wings cutting the air in a single unified motion. The Whitakers attended every church service that winter, their pews spotless, their hymns sung at the same measured volume as always. No one confronted them directly about Reverend Bell, though his absence hung in the air like a note that refused to fade. His name was added to the prayer list, and Prudence bowed her head with the same gravity as she did for the sick and the dying. By spring, the Whitakers' planting had begun earlier than anyone else's, the ground in their far field still strangely pliant while others struggled with frozen clods. Josiah worked alone there at first light, moving with slow precision, pressing something unseen into the soil at regular intervals. From the road it looked like care. From closer, not that anyone dared. It might have looked like devotion. When the frost finally left the county and the first shoots broke through the earth, the Whitakers' crops rose faster and stronger than ever before. People said it was God's blessing. A few wondered if it was something else. But by then Reverend Bell had been gone for nearly 6 months, and the town had learned what the Whitakers already knew. Silence could be just as binding as any chain. By the time winter loosened its grip in 1863, the county had begun to speak in low tones about the strange things the rain revealed on the Whitaker farm. That spring was wet and restless, storms dragging across the fields with a heaviness that left the air thick. In the Whitakers' far pasture, after each hard downpour, pale fragments surfaced in the furrows. At first they were small enough to pass as animal remains, a curve of rib, a chip of jaw, but the shapes grew harder to explain. Some were too thick for deer, too straight for hogs, and one piece, washed clean by a night of unbroken rain, bore the unmistakable cup of a human knee joint. Josiah's answer was ready before the questions came. The county, he told anyone who asked, sat atop old burial grounds, some Indian, some from the earliest settlers, and the plow had likely disturbed them. He spoke of history as though it were just another crop, buried deep and waiting to be turned over. People wanted to believe him, and most did, at least publicly. Still, some kept their children away from the Whitaker property even when Prudence offered fresh bread for the Sunday table. The bones were not clean when they rose from the soil. They carried a faint tackiness that the rain didn't wash away, and their edges showed marks that made the county coroner uneasy. The man had been called once quietly when a farmhand brought in a piece he'd found in the lower pasture. A section of femur, pale as driftwood and grooved in neat rows. Under lamplight, the coroner traced the indentations with a gloved finger. They were not the irregular tears of an animal's bite, but narrow arcs, paired and precise like the impressions of human teeth. He told no one but his wife. The next morning, the bone was gone from his desk. The farmhand swore he had left it there, wrapped in cloth, but the coroner only shrugged and told him it was likely misplaced. Later, when the man passed the Whitakers' market stall, Eliza met his gaze for a heartbeat too long, her lips curving into something that might have been a smile but felt closer to a seal being pressed over a jar. Rain became a strange herald that year. Each storm swelled the ground, and each time the Whitaker fields yielded more than crops. The damp air carried a smell that wasn't quite rotten, sweeter and somehow sharper, that clung to the clothes of anyone who walked too close. When the clouds broke, mist would linger low in the furrows, curling like breath from beneath the soil. The Whitakers treated it as nothing unusual. Josiah worked the plow in the steaming fields while Prudence followed with a basket of seed. Eliza moved between them, carrying a small tin of gray powder she sprinkled in the rows, each handful measured, each step evenly spaced. If a bone surfaced, Josiah would kneel, brush away the dirt, and carry it to the edge of the field without pause. No one saw where it went after that. Neighbors began calling it bone weather, half joke, half warning. They spoke of it as if it were just one more quirk of rural life, like early frost or late blight. But there was unease under the laughter. One farmer, after finding a set of finger bones in his own plow line, swore they were from a child. He took them to the sheriff, but the man only shook his head and said the county's history was littered with unmarked graves. 2 weeks later, that farmer's milk cow was found dead, its hide unbroken, its eyes gone. The Whitakers, meanwhile, thrived. Their root vegetables were the largest in living memory, their grains full and golden. They won ribbons at the county fair, smiling for the photographs in their clean Sunday clothes. No one mentioned the faint grayish tint to the potatoes, or the way the carrots seemed to resist rot even when left in the pantry for weeks. By autumn, the rain came less often, but when it did, it brought the same offerings. The Whitakers no longer bothered to explain. They gathered what the storms unearthed before anyone else could see, working in silence, their faces calm. The ground seemed to know them, to yield its secrets only when they were near, and to close itself again as soon as they passed. It was then, though no one could prove it, that the rest of the county began to understand. Whatever lay buried in those fields was not a relic of the past, but part of the present, feeding something that would not die as long as the Whitakers tended it. The drifter came on a night when the wind folded smoke back into the pines. A thin young man with a torn coat and the kind of tiredness that makes anyone hungry for kindness. Josiah met him at the gate with the same small smile he'd give a neighbor, watered his horse, and pressed warm bread into his hands while Prudence set a lamp on the table and kept her eyes low. He was grateful in the shameless way of the desperate, apologizing for his smell, for the mud on his boots, for breathing their air. Eliza watched from the doorway with that quiet, almost tender attention she gave to seedlings, as if measuring what the boy could bear before he bent. They offered a place in the hayloft just for the night, and the boy's thank you came out as a sigh that sounded like relief, finding a bed. The shed, crouched and listening, was ready. Inside, straw lay evenly, the bricks held a slow heat, and the hooks waited with that second notch that made them seem almost considerate, as if designed to steady rather than suspend. The iron didn't glint. Josiah kept it rubbed to a dull sheen that reflected shape but not face, a kindness to the eyes that would soon look up at it. He led the boy there with a lantern held low, explaining in his mild way that the hearth was cold in the house and the shed would be warmer. And the boy followed because the promise of warmth is a door that swings open on its own. He sat where Josiah pointed, swallowed the last of the bread, and reached for the tin cup without being asked, his hands shaking just enough to make the rim click against his teeth. The method began like care. Water first, a cloth to the forehead, a piece of leather pressed gently between molars. "In case your tooth aches," Josiah murmured, because everyone had their own reasons to accept a small burden. Then the quiet weight of a sleeve settled heavier than cloth should weigh, and a thin strap smoothed over the wrist to keep your arm from sliding, and the hook's notch took the load so cleanly that the joint did not protest. It was not a trap snapping shut. It was gravity redistributed in a way the body recognized as order. The second arm joined, not pulled high but held just so, a posture of someone preparing to pray. Eliza, patient and intent, adjusted the tilt of the plank by increments smaller than breath, and the throat opened into a slow, even line. Prudence kept time the way a nurse does, watching skin and lips and the tiny muscles at the corners of the eyes that tell the truth before the mouth does. Josiah counted. He always counted. 2 fingers at the neck pulse a metronome. He warmed a clay jar with his palm, checked the heat with his knuckle like a man testing milk, and set it near the brick to hold a constant that would keep shock from closing the door too soon. The room filled with the smell of iron and pepper and wood smoke, a farm's ordinary air that made the mind accept what it should have rejected. When fear surged, he eased the angle by the width of a fingernail and waited until the breath softened. He did everything in degrees. Blows ruined sequence, and sequence was the point. The first line opened without a scream. It was the small sound canvas made when pulled tight. Josiah drew a narrow strip from the shoulder's edge, a ribbon so thin it trembled in his fingers before he pinned it to the rack that stood like a loom. The notch in the hook prevented twisting, protected nerves he needed intact, and allowed blood to move in a pace that kept the mind present. He did not hurry. Between ribbons he pressed linen, counted to a number he trusted, then continued. Prudence poured what the linen could not hold into a broad, shallow bowl, and stirred it with a wooden spoon to keep it from skinning. Not to waste, but to keep texture uniform for what would be asked of it later. Eliza wrote nothing. Her hands were memorized, and the ledger received only a mark shaped like a taproot, as if the action were a season. Pain rose, sharpened, dulled, rose again. When the boy tried to lift his head, the strap met him with quiet refusal rather than force, and the refusal soothed him the way a steady hand calmed a spooked horse. The body learned the boundaries, learned the new location of permission, and gave itself to the pattern that asked slowly instead of taking all at once. He drifted in and out of a gray hallway where minutes lost their edges, and in that hallway Josiah's voice appeared only as numbers that proved someone was keeping watch. Outside, a night bird called and then fell silent with the wind. In the pause, the bricks ticked faintly as heat moved. Hours later, the rack wore pale threads like lengths of quiet rain. The hooks gave back what they had held without leaving a bruise because Josiah had buffered iron from skin with leather stitched by Prudence's careful hand. He set the angle to level, loosened each strap with that same unfailing patience, and the boy's arms came down in stages until they felt like his again. A blanket covered his chest. A cup touched his lip. He drank because he was told to and because the cup smelled like the wooden ladles mothers use. When he slept, it was not the deep collapse of the ruin. It was a guarded rest, the body drawing around itself and counting losses it did not yet understand. By morning, the shed looked like any place that had hosted a simple task. Straw raked flat, hooks wiped with ash to dull the memory of touch. Bowls washed with lye until the grain rose like goose flesh and then smoothed again under cloth. The rack stood quiet with its thin harvest, and Eliza carried those ribbons to the table where time would pull water from them and leave only the strength required for binding. Josiah walked the boy to the yard, pressed a small coin into his palm for helping with chores, placed bread in his coat, and pointed him toward the road with the kind of gratitude people do not question. The boy waved once, his sleeves sitting wrong on muscles that would ache for days, and he disappeared into the thin gray noon that follows a night of rain. In town, his absence explained itself. Drifters drift. No one counted how many passed. What remained were the small improvements that the Whitakers never discussed. The steady warmth beneath the soil even when the sky turned. The way a plow slid easier in the far field. The gray powder Eliza sprinkled along the rows with the same spacing as the notches on the hook. When she crushed the dried threads between stones, they did not crumble like food. They yielded like sinew deciding to serve a different purpose. The ledger closed with a root-shaped stroke and a single word. Held. And that was the truth of the hook, not cruelty displayed, but control maintained. The gentle geometry of keeping a body still long enough for a family to take what they called necessary and return it to earth with the care of a blessing. At the far edge of the Whitaker property, where the pines closed in tight enough to swallow sound, Eliza tended a garden that no one else was allowed to touch. It was a small plot no larger than a parlor rug fenced with thin branches woven in a loose braid. Inside, nothing useful grew. No potatoes, no beans, no herbs for cooking. Only lilies, tall and white, their petals cupping the air like hands. The blooms were too perfect for the soil they stood in, rising straight even after storms, their stems smooth as glass rods. People who saw them from the road thought them lovely but odd, and some wondered why a girl would spend her hours on flowers that neither fed nor sold. Those who looked longer noticed something stranger still. Every lily grew in its own shallow mound, each spaced exactly the same distance apart, and the earth around them was turned more often than any other on the farm. Eliza's work in the garden followed a ritual so steady it seemed instinctual. She rose before sunrise, barefoot, carrying a small wooden box under one arm and a narrow trowel in the other. She would kneel at the first mound, part the soil with delicate fingers, and check what lay beneath before setting it right again. If anyone came close enough to see, they would have found that under each lily was a single jawbone, cleaned so well that it caught the morning light like polished ivory. The teeth faced east, aligned as carefully as fence posts, their roots pressed into the damp soil as if they were planting themselves. Eliza never spoke about them. She never explained why, in the cool months when other flowers withered, her lilies remained as vivid as snow. Once a girl from the schoolhouse followed Eliza home out of idle curiosity. She was the kind of child who collected feathers and stones, and she liked to see what others hid. She crept after Eliza through the pines until the girl knelt in her garden. Eliza didn't turn, but she stopped moving for a long time, her back stiff, the trowel resting in the dirt. Then she began to hum, a low, formless tune, and resumed her work, sifting the soil with her hands. The following week, the schoolgirl vanished. The official word was that she had drowned in the mill pond, though no one saw her fall, and nobody was ever pulled from the water. That spring, one of Eliza's lilies was taller than all the rest. Its petals opened wider, and its scent carried farther on the breeze. The mound beneath it was freshly turned, the soil rich and black. When the wind bent its stalk, something pale flashed at its base. The curve of a new jawbone, smaller than the others, its teeth faintly crooked. A detail the missing girl's mother would have recognized if she had ever been brought there. Eliza's care for the garden was not gentle in the way people imagined a girl's work with flowers to be. She handled the blooms with the same precision she used when binding the mixture for the fields. She clipped dead petals before they could fall, trimmed stems with a knife so sharp it parted the flesh of the plant without bruising it, and watered only at certain hours, as though feeding the roots too soon or too late might wake something that should remain still. She spoke to the lilies sometimes, though never with words meant for comfort. The tone was closer to instruction, as if she were reminding them of their purpose. When townsfolk asked about her flowers, Josiah answered for her. He said they were a memorial to her lost parents, a place she could tend and remember them. Prudence would add that lilies were God's own flower, pure and unsullied, and that tending them kept a girl's heart steady. No one questioned it to their faces. They simply noted that the blooms seemed to thrive most after the rain had loosened the soil in the far field, when steam rose from the ground and the pines grew damp and fragrant. In time, the plot became a fixture of whispered stories. Children dared one another to touch the fence. They swore that when they leaned close, the air smelled not just of flowers, but of something faintly metallic, like coins rubbed between the fingers. And those who lingered long enough to listen said they could hear the faintest hum coming from beneath the soil, a sound that matched the pitch of Eliza's voice when she was alone among her lilies, tending the garden that no one else dared to claim. By late summer, the Whitaker Farm swelled with more life than it seemed capable of holding. The air over the fields hung heavy with the green scent of growth, the rows packed so tight that leaves brushed together in the slightest wind. But it wasn't only crops that filled the land that year. Strangers began to vanish at a pace that would have been impossible to ignore if the missing had belonged to the county. Instead, they were people passing through, vagrants who drifted along the rail lines, soldiers on leave from the war who didn't make it back to camp. A young pregnant woman said to be looking for work in the dairy barns to the north. They arrived in ones and twos, seen by neighbors walking the road toward the Whitakers' gate, and then they were never seen again. The Whitakers' barn filled with the smell of lavender that summer. Prudence hung bushels of the flowers from the rafters, the purple heads brushing the air when the loft door swung open. The fragrance was strong enough to mask other smells, the kind that clung to wood no matter how often it was scrubbed. Behind the lavender hung hams and bundles of herbs, decoys for any curious eyes. In the dim light near the floor, a false wall hid a narrow compartment stacked with neatly folded clothing, each garment marked with a square of muslin. On the muslin in Prudence's fine looping hand were initials. Nothing more, no dates, no explanations. Shirts and dresses alike were pressed and folded with care as though waiting for owners who would never return. In the culling shed, the rhythm grew relentless. Josiah moved with the efficiency of a man fulfilling orders, not indulging whims. His hands no longer paused between stages of the process. Every gesture was followed by another in perfect sequence. The bodies were chosen for their yield. Muscle for drying, marrow for binding, fat for rendering. The pregnant woman was brought in first, and Eliza took to her with an unusual quietness, working the angles of the straps as though making the woman comfortable before a long rest. Josiah said nothing about the child she carried. His work was with the body as it was, not the one it might become. The fields responded as they always did. Potatoes bulged from the ground in shapes almost too uniform, their skins unmarked by rot or insects. The carrots came up long and heavy, the color of rusted iron. The corn grew thick-stalked and high, each ear dense with kernels that shone like gold teeth. Townsfolk came to buy bushels at a time, marveling at the abundance, praising the Whitakers for their diligence. No one asked why the family's hands were always clean when their neighbors were stained with soil during harvest. When night fell, the work shifted. Josiah and Eliza walked the rows with a lantern, stopping at intervals marked in the dirt by small stones half buried in the furrows. At each mark, Josiah would kneel, dig a shallow hollow, and press something inside before covering it again. Eliza carried the basin with the binding mixture, her hands moving without hesitation, the handfuls measured so precisely it seemed she could feel the weight of each one before it left her palm. Prudence followed last, scattering a fine dust along the row, ground bone pale and soft that vanished into the soil as though it had always been part of it. On certain nights, the far field looked alive. A thin mist would rise from the ground, curling around the plants, and the leaves would sway, though no wind moved. The family would pause, standing still in the center of the rows, their lanterns dimmed, their faces lit only by the faint glow of the soil itself. It was not bright. Not enough to be seen from the road, but close up it was clear. A faint phosphorescence like the sheen of fish scales, spreading in a slow ripple through the earth. The disappearances did not go unnoticed forever. A farmhand from 2 counties came looking for his brother, who had last been seen heading toward the Whitakers for day work. Josiah told him the man had left after 2 days walking east toward the river. The farmhand left without argument, but later, while drinking at a tavern, he mentioned that as he rode past the far pasture, he had seen something strange. A row of stakes, each with a strip of cloth tied to it, fluttering in the still air. The strips were cut from shirts, he swore, and all of them had been washed. By the time the first frost touched the ground, the harvest was complete. The Whitakers filled their cellar with enough food to feed them through 2 winters. Crates of produce went to market, bringing in more coins than any year before. And still the barn smelled faintly of lavender. The folded clothes remained in their hidden place, and the muslin tags with their careful initials multiplied. The season had given all it could, and so had those who had passed through. Though only one of those harvests would be spoken of outside the family. By the end of that same year, whispers began to spread among the few farm hands who had ever worked more than a day on the Whitaker land. They spoke of the far field as if it were alive, and not just in the way all fertile soil seems to live. They meant breathing, slow, steady, and felt through the soles of the feet like a pulse buried deep below. At dusk, when the sun sank behind the pines and the air cooled, the sensation was strongest. Stand still in the center of the field long enough and the earth would seem to lift under you by a fraction, then ease back, as if it were drawing something in and letting it out again. Most workers dismissed it as the imagination that comes with fatigue. But one young man, stubborn enough to test the truth, lingered after his day's work, hiding himself behind the wagon until Josiah led the others away. Alone in the fading light, he stepped between the rows, feeling the damp give beneath his boots. The first rise was so subtle he thought it a trick of balance, but the second made him pause. The soil was warm. Not sun-warm, but body-warm, even though frost rimmed the fence posts and his breath hung pale in the air. Then it happened. Something soft closed around his ankle from beneath the dirt. It was not the grip of a root or a snagged vine. It was the curl of fingers, thin, deliberate, and strong enough to make him stumble. He yanked his leg free, heart hammering, and in his panic he imagined he heard a low sound, not quite a voice rising through the ground. He did not stop running until he reached the road. The next morning, Josiah told him there was no more work for him that season, pressing a small sack of potatoes into his hands with that same mild smile. The Whitakers themselves seemed to sense the field's rhythms. They often walked it in silence, Josiah leading, Prudence a few paces behind, and Eliza bringing up the rear. At times they would stop, all three turning their heads toward the same patch of soil, their expressions unreadable. Eliza would kneel, lay her palm flat against the ground, and close her eyes for several breaths before standing again. Whatever they were listening for, they always seemed satisfied. The plants in that field were different too. Their stems were thicker, their leaves darker, their roots more stubborn to pull. On more than one occasion, a beet or potato brought up in the harvest bore faint impressions along its skin. Shallow ridges in patterns that looked disturbingly like the curve of knuckles or the press of teeth. Prudence would cut away the marked portions without comment, adding the rest to the baskets for market. Some nights neighbors swore they could see a faint shifting of light in the far field. It wasn't lantern glow, it didn't flicker, but a muted shimmer, low to the ground as though something beneath the surface was moving through the soil. On those nights the Whitakers stayed out late, their figures small and dark against the rows. When they returned, the smell of the field clung to them, a mix of earth and something faintly metallic like the air inside a closed iron stove. One winter evening, a rare heavy snow fell, covering the farm in a perfect white sheet. By morning, all was still and buried, except for the far field. There the snow had melted in long, narrow strips, revealing the dark soil in patterns too even to be natural. Seen from the hill road, it resembled a set of ribs curved and branching outward, the mounds of earth between them breathing steam into the frigid air. Those who saw it said nothing aloud, but later that week more than one family quietly began avoiding the road past the Whitakers altogether. The family never denied the odd warmth of their land. If asked, Josiah would shrug and say that good soil holds heat. Prudence would add that life itself is a kind of warmth, and the farm was full of life. Eliza said nothing at all, though once, when a neighbor boy called her the girl with the living field, she only tilted her head slightly as though weighing whether to correct him, and then turned away without a word. The truth was that whatever pulsed beneath that ground had become part of the farm's cycle. It was tended, fed, and kept undisturbed until it could give back in ways no ordinary land could. To the Whitakers it was not strange, and it was not frightening. It was simply theirs. And like all things they claimed as theirs, it would be guarded, no matter what the soil had to take in order to. It was the summer of 1864 when the sheriff finally stepped onto the Whitaker property with purpose. The official reason was the number of missing travelers reported along the road in and out of the county, but there had been other whispers. Bones turning up after rain, clothes vanishing from wash lines, and a farmhand's story about something warm and gripping beneath the soil. The sheriff brought 2 deputies and a hired man with a strong back, claiming they were there to inspect an old property line. Josiah welcomed them with the same mild courtesy he showed all visitors, offering water from the well and a place in the shade. Prudence stayed on the porch, hands folded in her lap, eyes tracking the men without ever lifting her chin. Eliza was nowhere in sight. The far field was their destination, though none of them said it outright. The sheriff walked ahead, eyes scanning the ground for the signs he had been told to expect. Soft mounds, steam on cool mornings, the faint smell of iron. Sil stopped at a patch where the soil looked recently turned, the earth darker than the rest. The hired man put his shovel in without hesitation. The soil gave too easily, warm even at depth, and within minutes the first shape emerged, a pale curve, smooth and hard. The deputies crouched close, brushing dirt away with their hands until the shape resolved into a skull. It was wrapped in strips of muslin, each strip carefully tied, the knots tight and clean. A small pin held a square of paper to the wrappings, its edges browned by damp. In neat handwriting was a date, and beneath it a single verse from Scripture. For dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. The sheriff said nothing, only nodded for them to keep digging. The next pit was shallower, and what lay inside was worse. Not whole bodies, but parts. A leg wrapped in the same careful fashion. A rib cage, each bone drilled through the crown as if to begin a process no one recognized. The holes were round, precise, too uniform to be the work of decay. In total, they found 12 such pits in the space of a morning, the remains inside varying from fresh to old, all wrapped, all labeled, all catalogued in a way that spoke of deliberate record-keeping. The air thickened as the sun climbed. Flies found their way into the open soil, drawn to what the wrappings concealed. One deputy crossed himself and muttered something about the devil's work. The sheriff remained still, his jaw tight. He had known Josiah for years, had stood beside him in church pews, had taken his bread and nodded thanks. Now he kept his eyes on the holes and not on the man standing just yards away, leaning lightly on a fence post as if watching a plow at work. When they were finished, the sheriff approached Josiah and told him they were placing him under arrest. Josiah didn't flinch, didn't ask why. He only set his hat on his head, dusted his hands on his trousers, and allowed the deputy to take his arm. Prudence rose from the porch without a word, stepping down each stair as though her feet already knew the path and joined her husband. Eliza appeared from the barn then, her dress clean, her hair pinned neatly. She stood at the edge of the field, looking not at the sheriff, not at the deputies, but at the open pits, her gaze steady until the last shovelful of dirt slid back into place. As they were led away, a light breeze passed over the field, stirring the soil in soft ripples. For a moment the air smelled not of death, but of something green and living, as if the ground itself were denying what had just been uncovered. Those who dug that day would later swear they felt the earth shift under their boots. Not a tremor, not the settling of loose soil, but a slow, deliberate movement, like the inhale of something that had not yet decided to let go. The trial of Josiah, Prudence, and Eliza Whitaker drew every able-bodied resident of the county into the courthouse, packing the benches until the air grew thick with sweat and whispers. Word had traveled beyond the township, carried by men on horseback and in letters folded twice before being slipped into pockets. Reporters from Milwaukee arrived in dusty coats, their notebooks ready, their expressions already sharpened into disbelief. The three Whitakers were led in together, hands bound in front rather than behind, their faces untroubled. Josiah's eyes swept the room as if taking inventory, Prudence's gaze fixed on the judge without blinking, and Eliza's attention drifted from the gallery to the rafters as if something far above interested her more than the business at hand. The charges were read slowly, the clerk's voice faltering over the number of victims which grew with each shallow grave accounted for in the far field. The prosecutor's table held the muslin-wrapped bones the sheriff had unearthed, each bundle laid out in neat rows that mirrored the Whitakers' own arrangement. The scripture verses pinned to the wrappings were read aloud to the jury, each one a passage about return, harvest, or the body's impermanence. They sounded different in this setting, less like comfort, more like instruction. When called to speak, Josiah did so without hesitation. His tone was calm, his hands resting lightly on the rail. He said the land was God's gift, and it was the duty of the righteous to feed it as it fed them. He spoke of the soil as though it had a soul, one that could be strengthened by what it was given. Every man and woman taken into the ground had, in his words, become part of a greater provision, their bodies turned into a blessing that nourished the living. He used no threats, no curses, just the steady language of a man explaining a craft to someone willing to learn. Prudence never spoke. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her wedding band catching the light now and then as she adjusted her fingers. When the prosecutor addressed her directly, she met his eyes but did not part her lips. Her silence began to wear on the jurors, who could not tell if it was guilt, defiance, or something older and colder than either. Eliza's turn came near the end of the trial. She stood, smoothed her dress, and looked at the prosecutor as though measuring him for a space in her garden. When asked about the jawbones beneath the lilies, she admitted they were there. She said they kept the flowers strong, that their placement was deliberate, that eastward-facing teeth meant the blooms would rise straight. When pressed about the missing schoolgirl, her only answer was that a garden needs tending. Her voice never rose, it never broke. The evidence was overwhelming, but the verdict was not swift. The jury deliberated for a full day, returning with a decision that the three would be sentenced to hang. There was no public outcry, no celebration, only the quiet scrape of chairs as people rose to leave, their faces pale. Outside, the air was heavy with late summer heat. The Whitakers were led to a wagon for transport back to the jail, and as they passed, Josiah glanced toward the horizon where his fields lay hidden beyond the pines. Some claimed they saw the faintest curl of satisfaction at the corner of his mouth. Others said it was only the sun in his eyes. Prudence walked as she always had, steady, her shoes finding each plank of the boardwalk without hesitation. Eliza, just before stepping into the wagon, turned her head toward a patch of bare ground beside the courthouse and smiled, a slow, knowing curve that unsettled even the most hardened onlooker. It was the expression of someone who had already planted something, someone who could wait for it to grow. In the days that followed, the county avoided the Whitaker Farm. The fields, untended, seemed to hold their own shape, the far pasture still darker than the rest, the soil still warm in the mornings. Those who passed on the road kept their eyes forward, but more than one admitted later that they felt watched, as if the land itself remembered their faces. After the hangings, the Whitaker Farm stood untouched for a season. The county argued over what to do with the land, whether to sell it, burn it, or simply let it rot. But in the end, no one stepped forward to claim it. The buildings began to sag under their own weight, the boards graying and curling in the weather, the roof shingles lifting in the wind like loose scabs. The fields, however, did not wither. Even without hands to tend them, the far pasture grew thick with grass, richer than any in the surrounding farms. From the road it seemed almost to glow in the early morning, steam curling from the earth as if the ground were exhaling after a long sleep. Children were the first to test it. They dared one another to run across the field at dusk, when the light went strange and the air grew still. Some swore they felt the same slow, steady lift underfoot that the old farmhands had described. Others claimed they heard the faint sound of breathing, not wind, not the creak of the grass, but the measured rhythm of something alive just below. They would run back to the fence with their chests tight, too afraid to speak of it until the road was between them and the pines. By the second year, bones began to surface again, just as they had during the Whitakers' time. They rose after heavy rains, pressing through the soil like the earth was rejecting them, though these were not scattered or broken. They came up whole, jawbones, finger bones, ribs still strung with the last dry threads of sinew, each one clean enough to show it had not been buried long. Some were still wrapped in muslin, the knots intact, the scripture verses pinned and legible despite the damp. The county sent men to collect them, but the piles only grew, as if the land had far more to return than had ever been taken from it. In the town, talk shifted from justice to curse. Some said the Whitakers' deaths had only freed whatever was bound to the soil, allowing it to rise unhindered. Others claimed Josiah's work had been a pact, and that without him to manage it, the earth was spilling its yield in the only way it knew. The church preached against superstition, urging the people to remember the hangings as an end to evil. But even the minister avoided the road past the farm when evening fell. Eventually, the county fenced off the far pasture. The wood was new and strong, but it did little to keep people out. Young men crept through to prove themselves, only to leave shaken, their boots heavy with mud that seemed to cling too long. One described standing in the center of the field and feeling the ground shift under him in a slow ripple, as if something had turned over beneath the soil and settled again. He left that night and never returned to the county. Decades passed, but the field did not change. Grass gave way to wildflowers in spring, then back to grass, but the soil remained black and warm. Farmers tried to work the surrounding land, but their crops failed, as if the fertility refused to spread beyond its own boundary. The bones kept rising, and each time they were taken away, more would follow after the next rain. No one knew how deep they went, or how many still lay beneath. In 1912, a memorial stone was placed at the edge of the property. It was plain granite, waist-high, with no names carved into it. The inscription read simply, "May the harvest never return." It was meant as a warning, though children still climbed the fence to lay their hands on the soil, laughing until the laughter faltered and they left in silence. Some claimed the warmth under their palms lingered for hours afterward. The farm's story became a kind of folklore, told in kitchens during storms and around autumn fires. People debated whether the Whitakers had been mad, evil, or simply caretakers of something they could not name. Old men who had seen the trials said the family believed in what they were doing, that they spoke of it without shame, as if the rest of the world simply did not understand the nature of the bargain. In the end, the Whitaker farm was never plowed under, never sold, never burned. The fence weathered and fell, and the land returned to itself, though itself was something the county could not quite define. On quiet mornings, mist still clung to the far field, and if you stood at its center, you could feel a faint lift under your feet, followed by the slow release of breath from a mouth that was not there. The land kept its own memory. It kept the warmth, the bones, the rhythm, and it kept the lesson Josiah had once spoken in court, the only one the county never forgot. That evil need not roar or strike to thrive. It can work season by season, patient and unseen, until its roots are so deep that nothing will pull them free. What do you think? Could this happen again?